let's get going. We're going to do a little bit of review tonight because we were here last week. And welcome, Susan, that you're joining us. Just by way of sharing, the reason we weren't here last week is we went to Ray and I both went, and Pauline went, I think, yeah, to a program where you had Dennis Prager, a Jew, on the stage with Jack
Gibbs.
Hibb, his last name is Hibb, I don't remember.
G-I-B.
Yeah, who's the pastor of the Calvary Chapel in Chino Hills. And they were just having a dialogue back and forth, Jews, Christians. They were a little light on theology. They spent a great deal of the time talking about Ukraine and politics and all that. So I don't have a lot to share about what the difference between Jews and Christians are, although except for one insight, which I found very interesting, and I had never actually thought about it before, because eventually they did ask the question, the moderator, why is it that Christians believe Jesus is the Messiah and Jews do not? Well, Pastor Hibb, I went right away to Scripture, and he went through, prophecy, and obviously, this is the Messiah. Because, the Jews are waiting for the Messiah also. They're just still waiting. So Dennis Prager, if you don't know who he is, he's a practicing Jew, but he's very, very Christian friendly. Very Christian friendly.
Yeah.
So he thought about it for a minute, and it was a very simple answer, and I hadn't really thought about that before. He said, well, the big issue for most Jews is that they were basically the original monotheistic religion, one God only.
Yes.
And so for them, this whole idea that this guy Jesus, could actually be God, just didn't work for them. So it kind of explained a lot, why some of the Jews just refused to believe. Because at the end of the day, you can go through the prophecies and you can make an argument, which we as Christians say, well, obviously, he's the Messiah. But if you are generation after generation after generation, hear, O Israel, I'm the Lord your God, there's no other God before me, period, one God only, this whole concept of a guy coming along and saying, well, he's God and he's a man, they couldn't get around that. So you still have the corrupt Pharisees and Sadducees and all that power struggle kind of thing, but for me, it really helped me understand why your average, everyday Christian or Jewish people would have had a hard time accepting even all the miracles. And he made another comment. This was kind of really fast in passing, so he didn't make a big deal about it. But over the centuries, there have been many folks who have come along that the Jews actually thought was the Messiah. And eventually they die, which kind of disqualifies them. But he mentioned a couple of them, but there's been a couple of guys that have come along before. In fact, in the Scriptures, one of the Pharisees, I believe it was Gamaliel, he made the argument that, we really shouldn't be trying to persecute this guy. Because look, he's talking just to his group. Because really, look guys, if he's not of God, there have been other guys come along before, and if he's not of God, nothing's going to come of it, just like nothing came of any of those other guys.
Yeah.
But if he is of God, we don't want to be messing with him. Of course, they didn't listen to him,
No.
and which is good for us. But that was pretty much it. Dennis Prager is just a really, really, he's just a blindingly brilliant guy, basically. And I don't know, he's just funny too.
Yeah.
So I don't have much more to report. Anything jump out at you, Ray?
He might be my favorite Jew.
Yeah, well, get it.
Yeah.
Lee Brooks is my favorite Jew. So.
Well, you're right about that. Second
Yeah.
favorite behind Lee.
Yes, sir.
The Jews recite, I forget where it is, the Shema every day.
Deuteronomy 6.
Shema Yisrael.
Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God is one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, you know it in English, but
Yeah.
Well, how do you get around that? They say it every day. The Lord is this
One.
many.
One. And what's the first commandment?
Or they're looking for two messiahs. one that comes as a suffering servant,
Mm-hmm.
and then a separate one has to be separate
Yeah,
to rule from the
Mm.
throne of David.
Yeah,
So there has to be either none or two.
That's a very good point.
So,
and there you go. And then you throw into the mix during Jesus' time, the predominant view of what the Messiah would be. Remember, they're under the heel of the Roman Empire. The predominant view in their day was that the Messiah was going to come along and restore the throne of David. So they were really kind of looking like, if you go back to the book of Judges, every time Israel got in trouble, they got in trouble for a long time, and then God would send a judge who was always a military leader. And the military leader would lead them back to God and blah, 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 blah. So they had that pattern. So the idea was when the Messiah came, he would be someone who would restore the throne of David. And I think I've mentioned it before. I don't know if I mentioned it in here. I have a personal theory, which I cannot, justify scripturally or scholarly, but based on the facts, I suspect that though Satan did put it in Judas's head to do what he did, I think the reason it worked so well with Judas, and I've always thought this, is Judas was one of the zealots. And it was the zealots who were waiting for the military leader to rise up. And so he's with this guy for 3 years, and all this guy talks about is love and peace, and love your neighbor, turn the other cheek, and all that. So he goes in, remember they have the triumphal entry, right? So I'm thinking that Judas thought, this is it, man. Everybody's all excited, the Messiah's here, and nothing.
Wow.
So I have this theory, I always try to qualify it because I can't justify it by scholarly work, is that he actually did what he did partially because he thought that if Jesus got arrested, that would light the match and the people would rise up. Because look at what happened when Jesus died. He goes right back to the leadership and says, wait a minute, I don't want any part of this. Take your money back.
Yes.
Because we always want to paint Judas as this evil
Not
guy.
me.
no, I have heard the same thing.
Yeah, and if he really was as evil as we've always made him out to be, he would have said, oh darn, that didn't work, and he would have taken the money and run.
Well, think of the times the people wanted to make him king, but a king is a person who leads the army.
Right.
So that's really what they wanted, is somebody to lead the army and get the Rome out of there.
Right. So anyway, who
He
knows?
wouldn't
I'm
do
going
it.
to tell you,
So-
that theory that you just put there is brilliant. No, I'm not, I'll say it out loud to anybody if I hear it. Brilliant. I've never heard that before.
Well, and here's the reason I qualify it, because I'd never heard it before.
I've never heard that.
I've never heard anybody posit that because, well, when you're in school, you can't say anything. You can't write anything unless you can back it up with tons and tons of references. And I've just never read anybody that went along that path. But see, I'm stepping back from it. I'm just looking at the political situation,
Right.
number one. I'm looking at the religious situation. And it prompted me to think about that when Prayer said, the problem was he can't be Messiah because he died. So I'm putting all that together, and I'm thinking, Judas was with them for 3 years. If he was this rotten dirtbag that history has kind of made him out to be, I think one of the guys might have caught on to that.
Some of the guys might have caught on.
And even if they didn't know for sure, out of the 11 other guys, I think somebody might have said something about, well, let's not have him carry the money,
There you go.
right?
Yeah.
So he's one of the crowd and all this kind of stuff. And but when it all goes south, he's full of remorse, and he goes back, tries to give the money back. So it wasn't about the money, right? So I really think that, because if you follow the chronology, this is just, I'll get this wrong, 3 days after the triumphal entry, 4 days, 3 days, 4 days, whatever. And it was just a few days after the triumphal entry, which was huzzah, and the parade, and ta-da, and all that kind of stuff, and then nothing. So if you're Judas, you're going to go, wait a minute, he's supposed to be the guy, didn't you guys get it?
That's why.
I got to wake him up. Anyway,
I'm gonna
take that for
check
what it's worth, and we'll move on. All right, so let's, we are doing, just to be clear, I have a tendency to drift off into just church history, which is not, it isn't actually my goal. You're going to get a lot of history, but the purpose of the history is it's the history of Christian beliefs. And we're only dealing with 4 of them. So here is your first pop quiz. There's 4 up on that chart, and Susan gets an A because she wasn't here before. Okay. So what is Christology? That's an easy one. The doctrine of.
It's right there
Wow.
on the board.
You already got it.
Okay, they're all the doctrine of. Come on, that one's even got the answer.
Jesus Christ.
The doctrine of who Christ is.
Exactly.
And by extension, what Christ is. You know, the doctrine of Christ. Now the other one's a little more difficult. Soteriology.
Salvation.
Yeah. What is the doctrine of salvation? How does salvation actually work? Okay. How about ecclesiology?
Well, the answer
The
is
study of the church.
What is the doctrine of the church? Or more specifically, how does the church fit into all of this? And just like Christology, it's how does the church fit into all this, and what is the church's role in all of this? And then finally, eschatology.
We're not there yet.
It's escaping. That's the clue.
In times.
The end time. What is the doctrine of the end times? So who is Christ and what is Christ? What is the church and how does that fit into everything? How does salvation work? And what's going to happen when we get to the end?
Yeah.
Now, we haven't spent a lot of time on eschatology. We touched on it briefly. But so now we go back over here, and we started after the last apostle dies. John dies, basically 100. And for almost 300, 400 years, we're sorting out who Christ is. It's the main issue. Each of the councils dealt with some issues about who Christ was. There was a lot of back and forth. The main thing to remember about this earlier period, there was no church, capital C. Someone will tell you at some point in time that the church threw out the books of the Bible they didn't like. Well, that doesn't work because every single one of the books of the Bible had been written by this point right here. So all the way up to here, let's call it 400s. There wasn't a church per se. There were different centers of Christianity with different people in charge. And the councils were just getting together and trying to get some agreement on some of these issues. But the main issue early on was what are the actual books of the Bible? And anybody remember which one of the councils that was nailed down at?
The canon?
Yeah, the canon of Scripture. Which are the right books?
Chalcedon?
Laodicea, 350.
Nice.
So AD 350 is the first, not the first, but the first official, if you will, shot at these are the actual books. And there was reasons for that, and we talked a lot about that. All the way back in 325, the Council of Nicaea really dealt with who Jesus was, and they came up with this thing about a really funny Greek word called homoousia, which basically means all of the same substance. So all the way back here, they came up with the idea that Christ is of the same substance of God. Okay? They hadn't quite teased out yet, fully God, fully man. You know, we'll get to that a little later on. But it's all based on Scripture. Nobody made this stuff up, right? Go a little bit further down into the 400s. We have a council that decided that Jesus and God and the Holy Spirit are one thing called God. 3 persons, right? One substance. So they already got one substance back here. So the Trinity, there's 3 entities in a thing called God. So they're creeping along on this stuff. We get a little bit further along to Chalcedon, and they came up with the idea, which was novel, that he is fully God and fully man. Now, these are things that are familiar to us now, but look at this. We're 450 years down the road from Jesus' time, and they're just kind of codifying, if you will, that he's completely human and completely God. Now, the thing about him being completely human is going to be a big deal. In fact, tonight, one of the things we're going to be talking about is why that's a big deal. But this is all the way back here. Now, just by the background, I said we'd get a little bit of history. We had Augustine, who came up with some of the first principles that go behind that. And a lot of other stuff happened in here which we didn't talk on, but we did emphasize that along with all of these things that are going around in the background, in 410 AD, the Goths come down from Europe and they burn Rome. And then we go a little bit further, 476, the Roman Empire, or at least the Roman version of the empire, is basically gone. There's no more emperor in Rome at that point. So that's all going on in the background of all of these councils. And just as a side note, we come into now we're into the 600s and 700s, and 640 AD is when Islam shows up. Okay? Muhammad goes into a cave, he hears the angel Gabriel talking to him, and runs home scared to his wife, and she says, go back into the cave, and just remember everything that's told. It doesn't get written down until way after he's gone, but that's kind of how Islam came along. So Christianity was a known thing, right? Christianity was 600 plus years old. If you want to go back to when Jesus was here, well, 640 years, Christianity had been around. So in that context, Islam managed to came up. The only thing that's really critical to know about that is Islam is one of the three, what they're called, Abrahamic religions. Christianity, Christianity, Jewish, and Muslims all believe in one God, and they're all grounded in the Old Testament. The Muslims hold Abraham as their patriarch. They just go a different way with their interpretation of it. So we have a lot in common with the Muslims. So that's all leading up into this area where we're going to start picking up the thing right now. And we stopped last time we were here in 1020. What was it? I lost place. Oh, 1024. 1024 is called the Great Schism, which is where I want to pick up the pace tonight. This was a map, we had it before. The Great Schism of 1054. The Eastern Church and the Western Church became a thing. Up until now, it's been kind of all one church. The Eastern Church, which we know now as the Eastern Orthodox Church, split off over some theological issues. But the thing to remember about that is most of the time that we see up here, the capital of the Roman Empire was over here. It wasn't in Rome. This is where the emperor was. Okay? And when they started arguing about some of these theological issues, they split off. They had enough of each other, and they said, that's it. So, and the empire is still rolling, theoretically. The Roman Empire is still going. The people in this area at that time actually called themselves Roman. They were the Roman Empire. That's where the emperor was. So the head of the Eastern Church is called the Patriarch. And this whole thing is kind of in chaos because you have all the Germanic tribes that come down from Europe, and the Lombards, you don't need to remember this, but the Lombards have taken almost all of the center of Italy. And what's left of the Roman Empire, which isn't even an empire at this point, what's left of the Roman Empire is a little bit on each one of the coasts. So that's where they split. And the difference between them will become more apparent as we go along. Yeah.
So the half of the empire fits the prophecy in Daniel with the two legs of the Roman Empire, east and west.
Okay. I don't remember that, but
The legs of iron.
makes sense to me.
Daniel 3 and 7.
Yeah. In the book of Daniel, he has a vision about this great statue, and each part of the statue represents one of the historical kingdoms. All right, so this is where we are as we come up to this point. And by the way, Christianity is doing well at this point. The details are not important, but all of these little are centers of Christianity. Christianity is kind of everywhere, different dates. So it spread all the way to Britain, and they didn't put any marks over here, but we're talking about what is generally known as the Middle Ages now, or actually the early Middle Ages. This is also the same time as when they had the plague, and lots of people died of the plague and all that, but Christian scholarship actually in some ways picked up steam here. And so that's what we're going to talk about tonight. The rise of what's called scholasticism.
There were a lot of them then. I pictured kind of just a few scattered things, and that map is full.
Yeah, most of those are later Middle Ages, but there were centers of Christianity, little pockets of Christianity. Okay, there's a great book. It's a fun read. It's called "How the Irish Saved Civilization." In the worst of the Middle Ages, the Dark Ages, when the plague and all that, the Irish monks kind of huddled into their monasteries and locked the doors, if you will, and preserved a lot of the scrolls, a lot of the scholastic information of the age. And when things lightened up, they sent missionaries all throughout Europe. So this book makes the argument that they preserved civilization until after the worst of the plague was over, and then they spread it out again. I mean, they actually did that. I don't know if we want to give them full credit for saving civilization, but that did actually happen.
Plus they brewed beer.
Yeah. Okay. So as we move into here, into this area, into the early 1100s, 1200s, that's as far as we're going to go tonight. It's called the Rise of Scholasticism. You have very, very dedicated, full-time religious scholars that do some of the most extraordinary writing that you can imagine. And to this day, the bedrock of a lot of our beliefs and doctrines are grounded in the work that was done during this time period. So tonight we're going to talk about Anselm of Canterbury. It's actually 1033 to 1109, not 11-09. Sorry, I had to make a fast edit before you guys got here. He's going to talk about a couple of things: the ontological argument and the satisfaction theory. The ontological argument, we'll tell you what that is, but basically it's an argument for the existence of God. Okay, because people haven't really thought about that. You know, you go all the way back over here, and there isn't anybody really around questioning whether God exists. That's just kind of a given. But look at what's going on. When Rome falls, these guys are barbarians. They did eventually become Christianized, but they didn't start out that way. So, and so you still have a lot of people that, pray to idols and things like that. So I guess you look at it this way. They've kind of settled a lot of this stuff, so now let's step back for a minute. Let's take it all the way back to zero. And they start with, does God exist? So Anselm is one of the first guys to posit a theory, an argument, if you will, for the existence of God. So by the way, in theology, whenever you see the word argument, it doesn't mean this. It's a debate, if you will, back and forth. And then the satisfaction theory of the atonement goes straight to soteriology. So again, he's one of the first guys that dealt with that. Then we're going to talk about the Inquisitions. Notice that it says Inquisitions. There isn't one Inquisition. There are several. And they're not as, well, actually they were pretty evil, but they weren't as intentionally evil at the beginning. So we'll talk about a little about that. And we'll end up talking about the fourth Lateran Council. We've got all these councils up in there. And you're going to see when we talk about the fourth Lateran Council, just about everything that we know, particularly in the Catholic Church doctrine, was kind of set up at this point. So it's one of the most profound foundational documents of Catholic theology anyway. But a lot of the stuff that we hold to also. So they'll have 71 canons that'll explain everything. Okay, anybody confused, eyes glazed over, comments, questions, great inspirational thoughts? All right, well, let's talk about our friend Anselm Canterbury. That is an actual photograph. He didn't shave that day. So he formulated this ontological argument. So who is this guy? Anselm of Canterbury. He was a Benedictine monk. He was a philosopher, and he was the Archbishop of Canterbury from 1093 to 1109. He's called the founder of this idea of scholasticism. It's not something he actually founded. It's just he was one of the primary first guys who really dealt with this. He's been a huge influence in Western theology ever since. And he's mostly famous for the two things we're going to talk about tonight. He had quite a back and forth relationship with William II of England. At one point, William wanted to make him the archbishop, and then another point he wanted to throw him out of the country, and he did. And then another point they brought him back. And a lot of that had to do with, there was, by this point, a pope in Rome. So we have the patriarch in the eastern part, and then we have a pope in Rome, who's marginally the leader of the West, let's call it the Western Church. And so the question was, if I become the Archbishop of Canterbury, do I pledge my fealty to which pope?
Yeah.
What? Yeah, there were two popes going at this time.